For my skill acquisition project, I decided to learn the song Red Red Wine on bass guitar, as instruments have always been something that I've struggled to learn and I wanted to challenge myself. In order for me to successfully play a song on bass guitar, it requires bimanual coordination where both hands are involved in performing different actions simultaneously, with my left hand manipulating the fretboard and my right hand manipulating the strings in order to produce sound in time with a song. Under the dynamical systems theory, both myself and the guitar are complex systems comprised of a multitude of interacting subsystems, each with their own degrees of freedom. The complex systems I'm comprised of are the neural and musculoskeletal system, and the bass guitar's anatomy involves the fretboard, strings, body, bridge, output jack, and volume and tone control knobs, which are manipulated to produce a variety of sounds. Dynamical systems theory suggests that the body, when performing a skill, will naturally self-organize into attractor states, which are defined as temporary self-sustaining states, dictated by the organismic, task, and environmental constraints. Neural's model of constraints refers to the context in which a motor skill is learnt and executed, comprised of the organismic, environmental, and task constraints, which defines perception-action coupling. Organismic constraints refers to the physical and cognitive attributes of the performer. The environmental constraints refers to the physical environment in which the skill is performed and the individual's personal context socio-culturally, and the task refers to the nature of the skill being performed. In terms of this skill, my organismic constraints are my lack of experience playing the instrument. My hand size being on the smaller end makes it difficult for me to play the notes where the frets are far apart, and also finger strength and resilience, as a considerable force is required on the strings to play clean notes. Bernstein proposed the concept of degrees of freedom problem regarding our perceptual motor systems determining the best combination of movements to use considering the vastness of options. Therefore, he deemed coordination as the process of mastering redundant degrees of freedom of the moving body, and in other words, its conversion into a controllable system. In order to solve Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem, I adopted a constraints-led approach based on my individual affordances and attractor states, whereby the skill is not directly instructed and there are no imposed frameworks to learning. It is based around the perception via haptic, visual, and auditory feedback, physical capabilities of the performer, and the nature of the skill being executed. As improvements are made, the task and environmental constraints are to be manipulated to create variability. This suggests that my body would naturally self-organize into attractor states that are reflective of my capability, through freezing degrees of freedom in the initial stages to make the skill align with my narrow perceptual motor landscape, and unfreezing them as improvements are made, allowing for more complex and cohesive skill execution and affordances. This approach was conducted based on the concept that skill acquisition follows a nonlinear pedagogy, where there are periods of rapid movement, stagnation, and regression at various points, and the way in which a skill is taught should emulate its fluid nature. Historically speaking, traditional theories such as the informational processing theories suggested that actions were determined by the brain perceiving the demands of the task and referring back to a schema, or in other words, a visual representation drawn based on previous experiences to dictate the response. However, this does not explain how we learn skills that are not drawn from experience and would be a rather rudimentary and slow process. Rather, we perceive to act and act to perceive through a fluid process of adapting actions based on perceptual feedback. My training program designed around the CLA was characterized by self-discovery in the initial week, followed by the introduction of slight constraint manipulation in the second week, which was further nuanced and challenged in the third and fourth week, in order to create the most robust attractor states indifferent to the imposed constraints, thus leading me to become an adaptable performer in the context of this skill. The way in which I measured performance to gauge improvements was by conducting a baseline test at the end of week 1 to be retested at the end of every week, where I was tasked with playing the song and measuring the number of successful note transitions in time. Successful note transitions characterized by finger placement, clarity of sound, and timing. A transfer test was also conducted at the end of week 4, involving playing the song with my eyes closed and recording the number of successful chord transitions using the same criteria as a baseline test. And lastly, a retention test was conducted involving playing the song 1.5 weeks post ceasing practice to determine whether the skill had been successfully attained. So, week 1, I started by learning the anatomy of the bass guitar. I started playing random notes to gauge the haptic understanding of the appropriate finger pressure and picking technique, as well as how to tune the guitar and manipulate the amp. Once I understood these components, I watched a Red Red Wine bass guitar cover to gauge how the bass riff was supposed to sound. I then researched the bass guitar tab for the notes and started to self-discover the finger placements and pressure that aligned with my physical constraints. I also split the song into 2 bar sections to break the song down into more sizable chunks in pursuit of stable attractor states and to relieve the cognitive load. At this juncture, there were periods of attractor states, however the phase transitions tended to be long and there were many lapses. Therefore, the introduction of tasks and environmental constraints at this stage was deemed unnecessary, as there would be nothing gained due to the juvenile stage of learning that I was in. Week 2 began with learning the entirety of the song's chorus, as it was the most frequent riff, and the other aspects of the song were built around the chorus with slight adjustments, which would assist in creating functional linkages between the different elements of the song. This week was also characterized by the introduction of the constraint manipulation aimed at perturbing my attractor states to in turn improve my adaptability as a performer by widening my perceptual motor landscape. I started to play the notes in sequence and added the task constraint of playing with a backing track to provide auditory feedback in regards to the timing of the note transitions and provide external stimulus. Week 3 was characterized by manipulating the informational and environmental constraints to test the stability of the attractor states that were developed within the first week of training. My approach to this was playing standing up, which changes the ambient optical array, making it more difficult to see the fretboard, which could potentially implicate the accuracy of finger placement without completely eliminating visual feedback. By limiting the amount of visual feedback and changing the ambient optical array due to the adjustments in body positioning, my body is forced to adapt to using just auditory and haptic feedback predominantly, which emulated the conditions of the transfer test, hence widening my perceptual motor landscape. Furthermore, the environmental constraint of playing in front of an audience added pressure and created an element of distraction, which challenged the stability of the attractor states, thus leading me to develop a greater ability to remove irrelevant information and focus on the task itself, improving my adaptability as a performer. Week 4 was characterized by further nuancing my skills through introducing a dual task procedure of playing in time while simultaneously having colors flash up on the screen and having to recite the colors. This created a high degree of contextual interference to the task, as I had to simultaneously perceive and recite the colors while playing, hence challenging my adaptability as a performer through the manipulation of task constraints, as dual task procedures in training have been proven to increase the robustness of attractor wells. I also introduced the constraint of playing through the song while closing my eyes for 5-second periods intermittently. Due to the lack of visual feedback for periods, it constrained me to utilizing predominantly haptic feedback and implicit timing, which challenged the stability of my attractor states. Therefore, by increasing the cognitive demand of the constraints each week, it prevents stagnation of the skill development and increases neuroplasticity. The results demonstrate the success of a constraints-led approach to learning. As seen in Figure 1, for the baseline tests, the number of successful note transitions improved at the end of each week, suggesting that the manipulation of task, environmental, and informational constraints was successful in eliciting stronger and more stable attractor states that were also enduring, as demonstrated in the retention tests. Furthermore, as seen in Figure 2, the transfer tests highlighted that the program was also successful in broadening my perceptual motor landscape, making me more adaptable as a performer through putting myself in environments that were similar to the demands of the transfer test but not identical, therefore allowing me to perform a skill successfully under a plethora of constraints. Through applying the CLA to acquiring the skill of learning Red Red Wine on bass guitar, I had successfully achieved stable attractor states that were able to elicit a repeatable performance irrespective of perturbations. By fostering implicit learning partnered with higher levels of variability and contextual interference, I was able to have greater agency over my learning process and achieve the best performance results in the context of being self-taught. This was reflected in the baseline testing in terms of steady improvements made each week, as well as in the transfer tests where I successfully performed 83% of note transitions, which is designed to have a higher degree of difficulty than the skill itself. And in the retention test, I was able to perform the skill within a 2-note margin of the week 4 baseline measure, suggesting the enduring attractor state wells that had been developed. Some strengths to my training program was the variability in the manipulated constraints, which allowed me to perform in a variety of environments and practice the concept of degeneracy, which is associated with expert performers. Another strength is in regards to how I broke down the task into sections to reduce the load on my neural and motor system, hence reducing the chances of burnout from compounded fatigue. Lastly, the CLA has a high degree of transferability where I could apply the same approach in learning more complex songs and adjust constraints accordingly. However, there were some weaknesses to my methodology. Some weaknesses of the program would be lack of reference in terms of what is considered a perfect performance or note transition, due to the fact that I am a novice and it's difficult as a novice to appraise performance to a higher degree. Another weakness is a limited time in which the skill was learnt and the retention test was performed, as despite it occurring after a prolonged period without practice, being 1.5 weeks, a more viable test would be if it was conducted a few months post. Lastly, the tracking of performance could have been more robust and appraised after each practice session rather than weekly to gauge a more gradual and nuanced understanding of how the skill progressed. Therefore, the CLA is transferable across a range of contexts, including within the sports sphere, for novice learners in terms of highlighting the importance of self-exploration. Although in the initial stages, limited guidance may come across as detrimental, in the long run it creates a lot more rigid attractor states that both stand the test of time and variability of performance environments. Another practical application is in regards to utilizing constraint manipulation as a means of directing learning, rather than the classical instructional approach to teaching a skill, as learning is a highly individualized process that should be catered to the needs of the individual rather than the masses, and can be applied to any motor skill which doesn't have an inherent risk.